Students, today we shall learn the lesson interview written by Christopher Silvester. It is part of your textbook Flamingo. First, let's look at the author. Christopher Silvester was a student of history at Peterhouse, Cambridge. He was a reporter for Private Eye for 10 years and has written features for Vanity Fair. The interview is an excerpt taken from his introduction to the Penguin Book of Interviews, an anthology from 1859 to the present day. The interview, written by Christopher Silvester, is an excerpt taken from his Penguin Book of Interviews. In this, he talks about various opinions of the celebrities regarding an interview, its functions, methods, and merits. It also consists of an excerpt from an interview with the writer Umberto Eco. Let's look at part 1. Interview, an inevitable part of journalism, was discovered over 130 years ago. These days, it is nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, people who are educated are believed to have read an interview at one or other point in their lives. And on the other hand, almost every celebrity has been interviewed more than once. Many people have conflicting views about the usage and advantages of an interview. Some people have elaborative claims about its goodness, as they believe it to be a path towards knowing complete truth and consider its practice to be an art. If looked at from the interviewee's point of view, it may look like an unwanted intervention in their personal lives. It creates a picture in the minds of readers and viewers which, according to an old saying, steals the original identity of the person. Many famous personalities have a bad impression in their minds about interviews. The cosmopolitan writer V.S. Naipaul feels that the bad interview has a tendency of leaving them wounded for life. The creator of Alice in Wonderland never consented to be interviewed as he was too scared of the interviewer. He feared that a lot of attention would be drawn towards him, and thus he remained away from those who knew him. Those who wanted to either interview him or get an autograph of his, he would narrate tales of his success at avoiding such requests with satisfaction and enjoyment. Rudyard Kipling was strongly against the idea of getting interviewed. His wife recorded one such incident in her diary when their day at Boston was ruined by 2 reporters. She also made an account of why her husband refused to appear for an interview. According to him, interviews are immortal, and he calls interviewing a crime which would attract punishment just as any other crime. It is an extremely unpleasant experience, and no man with self-respect would ask or consent to it. Ironically, Kipling once carried on such assault on Mark Twain some years earlier. The famous novelist and journalist H.G. Wells said that an interview was an unpleasant experience, but 40 years later, he interviewed the Russian revolutionary Joseph Stalin. Another writer, Saul Bellow, commented that an interview seemed to be like fingertips on his windpipe, which means that he felt choked and suffocated when he sat for one. Despite the drawbacks, an interview seemed to fulfill its purpose of communicating with the audience. According to Dennis Bryan, an interview gives us the most clear impression of the people of our times. The setup of one man, the interviewer, asking questions from the other, the interviewer gives him power and influence. Let's look at part 2. The following is a part of an interview of the Italian novelist named Umberto Eco. He said that he wrote novels on Sundays. Mukund Padmanabhan from the Hindu newspaper interviewed him. Umberto Eco was a professor at the University of Bologna, Italy at that time. He was famous for his thoughts on semiotics, interpretation of writings, and the beauty of the Middle Ages. Later, he turned to write fiction. He wrote a variety of literature, fiction, academic texts, essays, books for children, and articles for newspapers. He rose to fame in the year 1980 when his book titled The Name of the Rose became a bestseller. The interview begins by praising Umberto Eco and quoting the words of David Lodge, where he mentioned that it is out of his capacity to understand how one person could be so good at so many things. Umberto replied by specifying that maybe it looked like he did a multiple distinct tasks. But according to him, he was always doing the same thing. Mukund curiously asked him about the same thing that Eco found himself doing. He found it difficult to put it into words, but began by saying that he had specific philosophical interests that he continually sought to pursue through his academic works and novels. Talking about his books for children, they all talked about non-violence and peace, which were again based on ethics. Then he talked about his secret that he worked in empty spaces of time. He called them as interstices. According to him, these empty spaces were very crucial. If you remove the empty spaces from the atoms or from the universe would be very compact, just as big as his fist. So, if he was expecting someone over, that is, someone was coming to his house, and the guest took the elevator from the ground floor to his flat on the third floor, as Umberto waited for the guest, that time was an interstice, and he used that interstice to write an article. That is how he worked in such empty space of time, which many people waste by sitting idle and waiting. Mukund mentioned that what he did was undoubtedly unique. His scholarly articles were very different from the usual academic style. The usual academic style lacked personal touch and was dry and boring. On the other hand, Umberto's writings had a certain playful and personal touch. He asked Eco that did he intentionally adopt an informal way of writing, or was he being natural? Umberto narrated his story from his time in Italy, where a professor told that his thesis was way different from others. He had told his story along with including the trials and errors that happened during his research. Others, on the other hand, made false assumptions, corrected them, and put conclusions. This was the reason why the professor even published his thesis as a book. At the age of 22, he realized that his way of writing was the correct way, and that his essays were always in the narrative tone. Probably this was also the reason why he started writing novels at the age of 50. On the contrary, his friend Roland Barthes always wanted to be a novelist along with being an essayist. Unfortunately, he died before he could do it. While for Eco, it happened by accident, but novel writing satisfied his hunger for narration. Pointing out his novels, Mukund mentioned that he became astoundingly famous after the publication of The Name of the Rose. From a famous academic, he went on to become a famous novelist, though he had written many more scholarly works than novels. Umberto Eco corrected that he had written over 40 non-fiction pieces. Amazed at hearing about Eco's over 40 scholarly articles, one of which was in the study of science or semiotics, he asked if he was at all bothered when people remembered him as the famous novelist. Umberto Eco replied to Mukund by accepting that yes, it did bother him being identified as a novelist. Umberto, on the other hand, identified himself with the academic community because he considered himself a university professor who wrote novels only on Sundays. He also attended academic conferences as opposed to pen clubs and writers' meetings. But on the other hand, Eco accepted that he was well aware that by writing novels, he was reaching a wider audience because 1 million people would not obviously be interested in stuff on semiotics. Mukund changed the topic and mentioned that The Name of the Rose was a very serious novel, and still it managed to attract a large audience. It dealt with detective stuff, and also metaphysics, theology, and medieval history. He asked Umberto if he was at all surprised by his success. Umberto replied that he was not at all surprised. The only people who were surprised were journalists and publishers. This was because it was commonly believed that people liked easy reading experiences and trash, while the truth was that through his novel he reached that small percentage of the population who liked challenging reading experiences. He understood this because he himself yearned to watch shows like Miami Vice or Emergency Room after dinner, but not all day long. He asked Umberto about the possibility of success of the novel having to do something with its association with medieval history. Umberto did not negate the possibility as he began to tell a story which he thought he did like a Chinese wise old man. He mentioned that his American publisher expected not to sell more than 3,000 copies, as in a country like hers. No one had ever seen a cathedral or studied Latin language. To their surprise, they ended up selling around 2 or 3 million copies. Umberto considered the success of his book a mystery. Had it been written 10 years earlier or later, the situation would have been different. Let's look at some new words. Philosophical means relating or devoting to the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence. Pursue means follow. Ethical, relating to moral principles. Eliminate means remove. Fist is a person's hand when the fingers are bent in towards the palm and held there tightly, typically in order to strike a blow or grasp something. Interstices means a space or a gap. Dissertation means a long essay on a particular subject, especially one written for a university degree or diploma. Hypothesis means a theory. Frustration means the feeling of being upset or annoyed as a result of being unable to change or achieve something. Narration, the action or process of narrating a story. To sum up the interview summary, we learn how many people differ when it comes to interviews. Nonetheless, they are very interesting and informative as seen from Umberto's interview. So children, I hope you all have understood the lesson on interview. Thank you and all the best.